Okay. 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 Okay.
Morning.
Good morning, how are you?
Perfect, good. All right, we're ready to get started. I think we have a quorum. We'll start with welcome and introductions. Karen, do you want to start us off?
Karen Marcus here on behalf of Barbara McQuinn.
Hi, Steve Sills representing Chuck Shaw.
Faith Schulstrom, represented Frank Barbieri.
Sherry Brown recommending Erica Whitfield.
Heather Canoes, Budget Director.
Carmen Campbell, I represent Marcia Andrews, District 6.
Welcome.
We usually take, okay. All right, our first item is to approve the minutes from April 18th. Any changes?
Move approval? Oh, sorry.
Okay,
Second.
okay. All those in favor, all those opposed, motion carries unanimously. And then we'll go into the FY20 budget. Do you have a presentation first, or?
I do. So we are, as I stated in the update for this board meeting, or this advisory committee meeting, there is a budget workshop with the board tomorrow. So I was just going to preview that presentation. We've already gone through much of this information, so I was really just going to highlight it, not go slide by slide. But if you have any questions or you want me to stop and pause, please interrupt as we go through. So first, we just have an overview of the budget development timeline for FY20. It started back in the fall of 2018. So now we're really at the conclusion of that process. We did have our first budget advisory committee on January 8th, where I gave an overview of the budget development process, how we actually build our budget. On February 14th, we had our second budget advisory committee meeting, and that's where we discussed the referendum and the school-based changes. And we released the school budgets on February 20th. We had our third budget advisory committee meeting on April 18th, and that's where we discussed an overview of all the consolidated changes, as well as the capital budget. And today is really the purpose of this meeting is for the committee to draft your report to the board. So we do have a board workshop tomorrow, and if the committee is able to come to a conclusion on the draft report, we won't have to have that meeting on June 13th, but I do have it set aside just in case. So tentative budgeted adoption by the board is July 31st, and final budget adoption is on September 4th. The census, the U.S. Census is what we use in order to compare ourselves to other states as to where we stand looking at funding, per pupil funding. The information was recently released. It was after our April meeting, but we have the updated per pupil spending through FY17. It always is somewhat delayed because they're compiling all the information from all the states across the country. And so Florida dropped again to 45th. And so it's not surprising, that's something that Mr. Burke has been stating, that as the legislature has been rolling back that RLE, they've really been taking money out of the per pupil education funding. And so we've actually dropped from 44th to 45th. And if you look back in FY 2007, we were 36th. So it's a significant, we're going in the wrong direction. The average per pupil spending is $12,201. In Florida, it's $9,075. So that difference in per student funding represents $531 million just for district schools, not even including charter schools. So our total general fund budget is $2.1 billion. You can see that the bulk of the budget is really set aside for schools, 75%, and that does include the referendum, which now makes up 10% of the district budget. We have our contingency reserve set aside at 3%. There is one change from the last meeting. The property appraiser provided the preliminary tax roll, and it was a reduction from what was estimated by the state. So we were expecting initially to get around close to $204 million from the referendum funds. We lost a couple $1 million there. It went down to $202 million. We spend a large amount of our budget on looking at utilities, and then when you're looking at departments, departments is 8% of our budget, but within the department budget, 30% of that is just on transportation, just because of the size and scope of that department. The contingency reserve will be increasing to $64 million, and that's because we're also going to have as part of the board policy, we have to increase it because of the referendum funds. So I went over the preliminary tax roll, that we did have a reduction based on the preliminary tax roll. We're hoping that that does reverse when we get the final on July 1st, but we have made that adjustment to the budget. It results in, if you remember, we were at a 1.61% increase in per student funding after excluding Best and Brightest, Safe Schools, and Mental Health and the Turnaround Program. It's now reduced down to a 1.54% increase in per student funding.
Were there things that didn't come on that were expected to come on, or on the property tax rolls, or just?
I don't have an explanation for the difference, but we do expect that July 1st, that it will, they're usually very conservative, so we are, I guess, we are hoping, but yeah, we're very hopeful that we will see an increase come July 1st. But we were able to balance the budget even with that reduction of the $2 million. I also adjusted the FRS rate because we have received the actual FRS rate. So originally I had set aside $2.5 million, equivalent to 0.25%. The actual rate increase was 0.21. So we did need that in order to balance the budget, so I did adjust that. And I did make adjustments for the amount that we're allocating to charter schools for the different state mandates that we have. Because originally, if you remember, this is the summary of where our budget outlook is. I'm already backing out the impact of charter schools in that top number, the $44.3 million. So I adjusted the Best and Brightest down to the portion that would just be related to the school district, because I was previously backing it out in both places. So instead of it being an impact of $19 million, it's really only 17.6, because $2 million of that is already addressed or allocated to the charter schools. So you can see that we do have a slight surplus of approximately $350,000. And the main components of the items that we talked about, are the main changes year over year, was really related to the school-based changes as well as the department changes. So we have gone through in detail all the changes within ELL, all the changes within the allocation, over almost $2 million of investments that were really reinvestments based on changes that we had made in previous years. We also had discussed those additional school-based investments that don't fall within the referendum, like adding the testing coordinator to each of the schools and additional extra duty days to help provide supports to the schools over the summer months. So total investments for all school-based investments is $5 million, but that is offset by some realignments that we had already set aside within ELL. With the mental health, We're investing $20 million. We know that we're adding one school-based position at every school. We also increased the number of counselors in middle schools and added extra duty days. With school security, we're projecting to invest about $20 million. Again, expanding the number of police officers at the school sites and continuing to fund extra security at the secondary schools, specifically school police football games, and also adding school security monitors at each of the secondary schools. We're continuing to fund the fine arts, so that's over 700 art, music, and PE, elementary art, music, and PE teachers, Choice and Career Academy. We also added 2 additional teachers to help support and expand the curriculum in the fine arts area. So that was a new addition. The bulk of the referendum is for teacher recruitment and retention supplements, and we expect that to be, over $100 million.
When will those supplements be made available to teachers?
They'll be reflected in their first check, so that will be August 23rd. So they'll receive it throughout the year. Yeah.
I see, over the
Prorated
course
throughout
of
the year, yep. So they'll receive it if they're receiving checks over 12 months, they'll receive it over 12 months, otherwise they'll receive it over 10 months.
Thank you.
The next part of the budget, when you're looking at the budget, is the charter school set aside. So those funds do flow through the district. We're projecting close to $170 million we'll be passing through. But what's important to note on this slide is that enrollment is slowing down. And you can see that from FY18 to FY19, the school district is the blue bar, the charter schools are the gray bar. We really haven't had much growth. It was, pretty steady for the district. Charter schools did have an increase of about 200 students. And for next year, we're projecting very similar, we're not going to continue to see that large growth that we happen to see when you're looking at between 16 and 17 and 17 and 18. For charter schools, we do have to project the number of schools that are going to open, the number of students that they're going to have. It doesn't mean that all of those students are going to come from district schools. A lot of times they end up taking students from other charter schools. So we're estimating an increase of about 400, but that is hopefully more on the conservative side. But it does look like there's 4 new charter schools that will be opening up next year, but there could also be some closures as well.
Are there issues about population movement so that, some schools will be emptier and some schools will be overcrowded as the student numbers stay the same, but the kids move around? Is that?
I mean, that is always a concern that the boundary committee addresses as to how we're shifting and moving the schools and where we build new schools. And that was one of the arguments that we had with the state when they said that we had more than enough seats, they wouldn't let us build certain schools. We had to explain the size of our county and that there are certain areas where you can't, force kids to be bused an hour just because there happen to be seats at that school. So that's always a concern that they're working
But
through with the boundary
it's not
committee.
anything more exaggerated?
As of right now, no. But it's something that they had boundary changes at, I believe it was at the last school meeting or the school meeting in April. So it's always a consideration and something that's not a pleasant.
When you're growing, you tend to keep schools full enough, but when you're not, it sometimes shifts.
Yeah, and, looking at consolidating schools. So I know that that's something that they're looking at on an ongoing basis. So the next area of the budget is departments. And so the department budgets are built a little differently than the school budgets. Department heads are required to go through a detailed line item review of their budget. They actually have to present it to the superintendent and executive leadership. And it was a very exhaustive 3 days where Dr. Fenoy listened to each of the department heads and what's in their budget and what their needs are, if they had any needs. I presented out the results at the April 18th meeting in a little different format than what I have here. During that meeting, I aligned each of the requests to the strategic plan. I have it presented here where it's broken out by the department or the division that's actually requesting the additional resources. So we're starting with the board direct reports, so that's the Inspector General's office and the General Counsel. At our last meeting, the Inspector General only had a request for one senior auditor position to be funded through the sales tax referendum. After the last board workshop, they actually added 2 positions. They added a request for an additional investigator as well as a senior financial analyst, with the purpose that they're adding a new work paper system, and they need assistance with the implementation of digitization of those audit work papers.
And how large is that department now?
That department has 18 staff.
And it started with 3?
No, it started with, I don't have the exact numbers for you. I want to say it was around 11 or 12, but I don't have the exact numbers. I know that there's going to be a board workshop because there was growth when the investigation division was added within the IG's office. And so I know that the board had requested some information as to what the growth was, adding that additional component, and I know that the IG's office is working on that.
So another department was folded in, I didn't realize.
Well, they added a new department.
Oh, okay.
And so it used to just be an audit department, and then the board in 2000 and I believe it was 2013, they added an investigation division as well. And so it was a completely new division. And at that time, the board was trying to decide whether to create an in-house inspector general or whether to contract with the county's inspector general.
That's when I remember it being added, and I didn't realize, I mean, it seems like it's growing every year.
And they did have a request last year that was not approved, but they did have some requests in the previous year. And I know that in their reports to the audit committee, they have, a lot of work in trying to, they're trying to reduce, I guess, the lag in getting those reports issued timely as part of their explanation. And then also the growth with the sales tax referendum. There are a lot of new projects that the district, for several years, we didn't have any money for construction. And now with the sales tax referendum and those funds, there's a lot of work that they're doing on the capital side. And so they believe they need some additional staff to help ensure that we're spending those funds appropriately, to help just provide that support.
Thank you.
The general counsel to the board is also requesting 2 attorneys. And then they have, due to increased litigation and workload, I know that they have attorneys that they have to review all of the contracts that the district enters into. And with the sales tax referendum, there has been a significant increase in the workload. And then just overall litigation. And I'm sure you've been reading about that in the paper as well. And then they just had increases in their just regular operating costs. The annual software licenses they use have increases, so that's the $12,000. Originally, I had not included that as part of the board direct reports. I just had included that $12,000 in other because I see it as something that we need to pay for. They need to keep it. But since I now broke it out by each division, I moved it over from just the miscellaneous other under the general counsel to the board. The next division is the deputy superintendent. So the deputy superintendent was looking to add 2 instructional specialists, and these were the ones that were related to testing. So one was moving, right now is having somebody, we have a lot of money in our school district. We generate a lot of money from AP, IB, and ACE testing. If we're not the largest in the state, we're close to the largest in the state. And so this position would be dedicated to providing support for AP, IB, and ACE. The other is just to help create effective, working with the FSA and just providing additional supports to those testing coordinators that we're adding to each of the school sites. That's what that other position would be supporting. So
Is that like practice tests?
that and provide throughout the year, because we do have the testing throughout the year, as well as those specific times when the FSA and those state mandated tests during that time period as well. And since we are going to have a testing coordinator at each of the high schools, this position would be providing the supports and the PD to make sure that they're all working consistently.
I thought the FSA was going away.
It is possible with the Common Core. I know that they're looking at what the changes are going to be, but we still, like Ms. Schulstrom had mentioned, in addition to the FSA, we're doing a lot of testing internally, just monitoring to make sure that the students are on track. And so I know within the planning department, that's something that's ongoing throughout the year.
Yeah, I know the FSA drives everybody crazy, mostly the kids.
Yes, I would agree with that. We also talked
But it
about.
will be replaced by something.
There's always been a
Yeah.
test, maybe just not as much.
And we do have, like I said, the internal benchmarks just to make sure that the students are on track. And that's what this position would help to support as well. We talked about the adding 2 Broad residents. So 1 Broad resident would be under the deputy superintendent, the other under the chief operations officer. And then there's just some more non-salary related to just PD membership, general supplies. There is the assistant superintendent for transformation is going to be retiring, and so there's some overlap. Part of this, it's not adding an additional position, but it's just having some overlap for 6 months to have some transition, because this individual has been with the school district for a significant amount of time. And then he was able to have some realignments within his department, elimination of extra duty days within the assessments department, which helps to offset one of those new instructional specialist positions, as well as some non-salary. So really for a savings of $120,000, so the net impact is $245,000. Chief of Human Resources, adding a manager for equity and access. Equity and access is one of the district strategic initiatives, so that's the purpose of this position. Adding to have a dedicated person to help expand that work. We also have a director for non-instructional recruitment. We have had challenges over the past few years of filling our bus driver positions, as well as a lot of our trades positions. So this director for non-instructional recruitment would help to focus on those areas. The chief of HR was able to eliminate a director position when 2 other departments were consolidated. So that's helps to offset adding this director position. So it's not an additional director position because it's being offset against one that's being eliminated. Coaching and support is also a strategic initiative of the school district in order to help to retain teachers. So they're looking to add 3 positions to provide those additional supports. There's also adding an EEO coordinator position just due to the increased number of cases and some non-salary as well. So after taking credit for the savings, the total impact is $481,000. The chief operating officer is adding the second Broad resident, and that those positions just help to provide additional supports within the department. Adding a general manager for custodial services, and also a technician within that area as well. We have, over 1,000 custodians, so they want to have a higher level position in order to help coordinate that function. They also want to have an initiative to purchase uniforms for all custodians. There are some schools that do that now, but they want to mandate it across the school district. So that's the most significant part of the 400,000. As well as we're seeing an increase in the number of infectious disease breakouts. And so that's the other significant component of the 400,000. And then increase in non-salary. So net of savings, impact of 655,000. The chief of staff. Now this is actually a reduction from what you saw previously. We first have an increased cost for closed captioning. That is something that the district is mandated to do. They did try to go with a lower cost option, but the closed captioning, it was not accurate. So we have to have so they're going with a different system, so there's an increased cost for that. We have an increase in just, similar to the general counsel's office, just general software that the department is using, software licenses, and then increase in travel, professional development, and just mainly non-salary of $20,000. Initially, there was a request for $85,000 for increased consulting fees. They were able to reduce that down by $80,000. So there's only an increase of $5,000 for consulting fees. So that's different from what was presented at our last meeting. So total impact of 58,000, and then within the chief financial officer, it's mainly due to, the main increase is just software that we use within the district where the license fees are increasing. And some non-salary as a result of the sales tax. The construction purchasing are doing more site visits to the project sites during when they're actually going through the process of entering into the contracts with the vendors. So that's a total impact of 31,000. So looking at all the divisions, the net impact after realignments is 1.5 million. So any questions on the department changes?
It seems to me that there's a lot of increase at the very top levels, and that it would have been good for us to look at those along the way so that we had an understanding of them rather than receiving it as a accomplished thing. And I know you've talked to us about there being money, but to understand what all of those are is helpful to us as we talk to the people that we represent and members of the community.
Right, and the last time when I presented the summary of the department changes, I aligned them to the strategic initiatives. And so breaking it out by division, I think makes it more clear as to where the actual additions were. Because when I was talking about the additions before, it
Money
wasn't
to do
clear
this.
as to which division it really related to. And so that was a recommendation at our last board workshop that they wanted to see it by actual division. So,
And that's the kind of thing that the community often talks about, is the fat at the top. And I'm not suggesting that it's fat at all, but I'm suggesting that it would be helpful for us in the future to look at that along the way.
yeah, and I guess the input from the committee that, looking at it by division seems like it's more clear than looking at it by strategic initiative. And so I'll make sure to do that for next year's meeting. And part of what the board also requested was for each of the division heads to speak to them prior to the meeting so that they had an understanding of what these requests were.
That's
And so-
exactly what,
And so I know that's what they've been doing for the past 2 weeks. Or at least each of the board members had the opportunity, if they had any questions. I know they requested a detail after that board workshop, broken out by division, which was provided, and then they had the option to follow up with any division head where they had questions. So the next component of the budget is the non-K-12. And so we have a lot of funds running through the budget that's not part of just our day-to-day student activities. So that's after-school, adult community ed, VPK, and just miscellaneous donations from the school sites. And so these monies cannot be used or are not used as part of the K-12 normal day-to-day operations. So we break those out separately because they should be self-sustaining. We do have costs that we have to set aside because we don't know at the beginning of the school year which schools they're going to be allocated to. And so those are ones that we classify as school and countywide costs. A lot of those are carryover funds. So as we close out this current year, FY19, there's a lot of funds like I talked about, APIB, ACE, those carryover dollars, whatever is remaining at the end of the school year, we have to carry over to that school next year. So we estimate how much we think that carryover is going to be. You know, we just leave it as a general amount, and then once we close out the school year, that's when we then allocate it to each of the schools. So where we have things here that are allocated or lumped into school costs, we use it as a holding place until we know which school the funds will be allocated to. And then countywide costs, those are items that truly are things that we pay that are costs that represent across the district. So that would be our claims and judgments, any settlements that we're making, the payment that we make to the Education Foundation, any miscellaneous payments that can't be identified to a specific department. So we have a set aside for countywide costs. Capital maintenance transfer. Capital maintenance transfer are funds that are transferred from the capital projects fund in order to fund anything that qualifies to be funded by capital dollars, but doesn't qualify as being as a capital project. So, for example, leases of our copiers, for example, does not qualify to be in a capital projects fund, but we're allowed to use capital dollars to pay for it. So we transfer money from capital, the capital projects funds, to the general fund. And so that's the purpose of the capital maintenance transfer. So we also fund our property and flood insurance. You can see there the equipment, those are a lot of it is the copier leases. Capital maintenance cannot fund any custodial expenses. It's all things that have our capital in nature. So the remaining parts of our budget, so utilities, phone, and data, we pay about $49 million a year for utilities. Our leave payouts have been pretty consistent. So we're budgeting the same at $17 million. And our contingency reserve, we had to increase that, so that will be $64 million for next year. And that includes the referendum, the adjustment we have to make for the referendum. So the highlights for this budget year, over $100 million we're able to invest in teacher recruitment and retention supplements, and that's thank you to the voters for approving the referendum. We have a salary reserve set aside of $15.4 million, which is a slight decrease from our last meeting, but that's because of the reduction, the expected reduction in the preliminary tax roll. If that comes in higher, any additional funds we receive will go into salary increases. We were able to fully fund the school police department requests this year. Again, that's a thank you to the voters because of the referendum. We were able to add 170 school behavioral health positions, 40 school psychologists, and we were able to expand the mental health contracted services. So we have been able to do significant investments this year as a result of the referendum. So there are still variables out there, even though the budget is balanced. What is actual enrollment going to look like, which we won't know until August. We start monitoring it throughout the summer, but what is actual enrollment going to be? We noticed last year, the counties to our south, they actually had declining enrollment. And so we were fortunate to at least have a slight increase. So we're hoping that we can at least maintain our enrollment this year. Also, the number of low 300 schools, what is that going to look like this year? This year we have 20. The previous year we had 27. That list won't be released until July. We also have the final certification of the tax roll on 7/1, which we're hopeful will be higher because we've already now reduced it. So we're hoping we'll be able to increase come July 1st. And we never know what's going to happen with the federal grant awards. They always threaten they're going to decrease them, but they usually end up staying about the same.
On the unfunded mandates, do you see any that are,
Well, it's the same ones that we have now. So security, they don't truly fund security for us to provide it at the level that the state mandates, but fortunately, we were able to get the referendum. But even looking at, the low 300, adding that additional half hour, we have the turnaround program, which is a new program. We don't even know which schools will be eligible till after grades are released, but we have to, submit a plan before we even know the schools that are eligible to participate. We're still trying to get clarification as to whether charter schools are also part of that turnaround program. Our initial thought is yes, but we're waiting for clarification from the state. So there's, they don't fund us enough for transportation. They don't fund us enough for ESE.
but nothing new?
Nothing new.
Okay. that was
Nothing
my
new
concern.
other than what they've already been doing. And then also the concerns with what is the impact going to be for that empowerment scholarship that was approved. And so initially, when we were estimating the impact, we were thinking that it was based on the total per student dollar amount, but it looks like the state was estimating the impact based on the base student funding, because their impact was less than what we had originally anticipated. So we don't have clarification on that, but it seems like they wouldn't receive the categorical funding, but they would receive the base student funding. Like I said, haven't received clarification, but theirs was less of an impact compared to our estimation.
And at this point, that's a somewhat limited sum statewide, correct? Like 128 million statewide?
Correct, and then it will increase each year, up to, I think it was 10% of
great.
the total enrollment. So it looks like an increase of, I think, 4,000 kids potentially a year. So we don't know what the impact yet will be in Palm Beach County, although those funds have already been set aside. They're already pulled out of FEFP.
So the number of schools identified as low 300, I'm just wondering if the third grade scores that I read about in the paper is impacting that at all. Will more schools be? It's not. I know it may not be the low 300, but will we invest in those schools, or are they the schools we're already investing in?
I would hope that those are already the schools we're investing in, and they did make an effort last year to not, so even though the number of schools went from 27 to 20, we still provided additional resources for those schools that dropped off the list. So they didn't have an extended day, but they did receive funds for additional tutoring and other initiatives. And so when we look at the number of the reading scores, what you mentioned in the paper, we didn't have any students score any lower than what we had in the previous year. So we're hoping that that doesn't negatively impact this so that we go back up to 27 schools. But we won't know for certain until the grades are released in July. But reading is definitely one of the key initiatives of the strategic plan, and one of the key initiatives and where we want to invest our funds.
Well, I had a question about that $350,000 surplus, and I'm sure there are lots of calls on it, but I would think that would be a high priority place for it to go.
I would agree with that. And so this is just, again, an overview of the timeline, which we've already discussed, but tentative budget adoption is July 31st, and final budget adoption is on September 4th. And so that is an update of where we are with the budget. So it is balanced, although I know the committee would like to see more money in salary increases for employees and initiatives such as reading and more school-based initiatives. We are fortunate this year with the referendum, with the amount that we were able to invest in security and mental health, as well as those teacher recruitment and retention supplements. So, any other questions?
So I'd like to get a motion that we recommend support of the superintendent's FY20 budget to be submitted to the board.
Move approval.
Second, okay. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Okay, and then our next item is our report to the board. I think that Heather emailed it out. Did anybody have any comments, or did you have a chance to look at it?
There, I just noticed there were a couple of things repeated on page 2 that are in the final recommendation and maybe don't need to be in the body.
Okay.
So at line 60 and line 77.
Okay, so eliminate line 60.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Thanking them once and not twice.
what?
Yeah.
Thanking the community once and not twice.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I agree.
yeah.
And I think mine cut off at after line 131.
Okay, so the last
Is there more after that?
one, so it says the committee
There's this.
recommends moving the superintendent's proposed budget as presented to the board for
I
adoption.
think we just did.
Right, so that,
Thank you.
One of the things I
So-
think, I don't know
So
how
what
we,
I'm just, excuse me,
sorry.
go ahead.
How we stress it even more is the paragraph that starts on line 20 about the downward spiral of education funding in the state. I don't know if you can highlight that, if we want to highlight that or something, because it continues to be a problem that when the state is not doing what they need to do, and then they try to take it away from the counties that want to do the right thing. But I don't know if anybody else wants to do that.
I mean, it's highlighting, I think highlighting it is fine. I mean, and then they run around saying, oh, we gave them all this extra money,
Right.
so.
Right, and that kind of disproves what they say.
Maybe bold line, like the first 2 sentences of that, at least so then it stands out in the report.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't check the numbers, but um, I assume you, so under departments, has an increase of 66,000, and I thought there was like 1 point some million? Or
Well-
am I reading this wrong?
It's offset against total realignments. Let me go back to. So in addition, we had $5 million for schools, offset by $1.9 million in, so we had $2 million of investments in ELL, offset by $2 million of realignments with ELL. With departments, we had an increase of 1.7 million, offset against $257,000 in realignments. The board direct reports was a total of 469,000. And then the additional realignments and estimated savings is $5 million. So those were changes in reduction in the workers' comp rate because we initially, 2 years ago, we had increased the workers' comp rate because of a change in the state law. We had expected to see an increase in our worker comp claims. That hasn't been realized, not only in our district, but statewide. So we felt now that we were comfortable with reducing that rate. And then the additional savings is related to contracted police because we weren't able to fill all the officer positions. So we were contracting with municipalities. We were paying a premium for those contracted police officers. So as we fill them with actual staff, we're going to have a savings on that premium that we were spending for the contracted police with the municipalities. So we're estimating to have savings of $5 million between the workers' compensation and the reduction in the number of contracted police services. So the net of all of those is what comes out to the 66,000. But if you don't think that's
So is workers' compensation a department cost?
It is. We allocate it to, based on salaries, and we have it set up in an internal service fund.
Okay,
And so we initially had increased that rate because it was expected that.
so that's like a per person
It's
cost
a
is
per
how you
person.
allocate it?
Correct. And then it's just that the expenses, the claims, the increase in claims has not been realized. And we wanted to wait at least a couple years to see whether there was a lag. But the state has also decreased, not only the state, but it's the National Association of Insurance Adjusters also reduced their estimate of what they expected the increase in worker comp claims to be. So now we finally felt confident in reducing that increase in the rate that we had put in a couple years ago. But if you want me to somehow clarify, instead of netting all of those changes, I grouped them all together. And so that's how I came up with.
Yeah. I just want us to be as transparent to the public as possible.
So I can show the total amount.
Yeah.
I think instead of just saying the
And
net
if-
amount.
as long as this is,
But I would agree that the figure here is, there's like several steps to get to that aren't well reflected when we look at what's on the screen. And I think maybe being, the word is transparent, clear to someone who reads it, I think would make more sense as a report.
Okay. No, I can add that.
and maybe just saying that rather than looking at it as though they made some kind of strategic realignments and savings, that due to those two big items, this netted.
Okay. And there was something that I meant to mention in the beginning. Our school district was just awarded the Government Finance Officers Award for Best Practices in School Budgeting. And so the GFOA went through a complete overhaul of their budget award process, whereas in the past, they just looked at their budget book, that big 300-page document we present at the end of the year. And what the GFOA said is there's a lot that goes into developing that budget book, and that really is just the end product. And so they changed the award process into looking at what is your budget development process? What is your community involvement, like having something like the Budget Advisory Committee? What is the transparency that you have in your school district? And we applied in FY18. We just received notice that we are only one of 8 school districts in the country that have received the award, and actually first in the state of Florida.
We
And
should
so-
note that in our report.
And so I wanted to mention that. We did, I know that the superintendent made a note to the board so that they would be aware of that. I think that was last week. So I know that my department,
Congratulations.
thank you.
Yes.
But I mean, thank you to my staff for preparing the over 800 pages of support that we had to send to GFOA as well. They also did an interview with Mr. Burke and Mr. Oswald, because we have to show that there's alignment on the finance side with the academic side, that we're not just preparing this budget in a silo, and that we have input from the academic divisions, and that the budget is really built to support and align with student initiatives. And so I was really excited.
I'm glad they recognized you, but I recognize every time we come together, your responsiveness to our requests is just amazing, and I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you, but,
Done a great job.
so I'm not good with, giving good news, but, or taking credit for something, but I really, truly was excited that we
That's
received
right.
this award.
Characteristic of the budget department.
The other thing maybe we want to include to show the community involvement is the oversight committees for the new monies. Is that appropriate to put in here, that there'll be a committee that oversees the utilization of those funds and the sales tax? I don't know what they are.
The IROC
Okay,
is,
that's what,
and ISOC. So the IROC is Independent Referendum Oversight Committee for the 1 mil referendum, and the ISOC is
The sales.
Independent Sales Tax Oversight Committee. So,
but so because there's like an urban myth out there, because I had a couple of friends ask me, well, that money will just go wherever they want. And I said, no, there are groups that are charged with the oversight that money goes where it's supposed to. So I think to let the community know that it's there.
Do they report to, do they make a public report? They do, don't
they do an annual report to the board
yeah.
for each of those
Yeah.
committees, but it usually is a written report.
But again, it should be publicized, yeah.
Yep.
Not just in our report. but-
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
So can we add a congratulations to you all for getting that award in this?
Yeah, definitely.
Sure, our recommendation. or
I
something.
wasn't telling you that to put it in there.
Like she said, other people are going to be reading this, and I think it's a
Yes.
good way
But-
to,
In my professional
didn't read
career, I
anything.
participate in the GFOA award, and sometimes I get mad with the reviewers because I think it's a little too subjective, we're like, we're doing that, so it's a big deal. So I realize how much work goes into it, so.
Well, just wait, because we were the first round of the new
So I was just
change.
thinking, oh gosh, that means I'm next. so,
Yes,
yeah.
it was, we applied 1.5 years ago. I mean, that's how long it took for them to go through our application, yeah. And so Miami-Dade did apply as well, but we've gotten it first, so.
But no competition.
in there congratulating is
Yeah.
appropriate.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you make a special note of that, that might get picked up by the paper. Just
you go,
because,
yeah. You should do a press release, actually.
I hope. They didn't pick it up from the board meeting, so maybe they'll get it from there.
Right.
Okay, so any other input? And would you like to have another meeting to go through the report again, or do you want me to make the changes, email it out to you, and then you could respond back to me?
That works best.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then, okay, all right.
I mean, I think we're all kind of in agreement on the
Yeah.
report and overall happy with it and things. So, if everybody's okay with it, just email us we'll call it the final draft.
Okay,
And I don't think we'll have to meet again on it unless you see something that,
Unless you need
respond
us.
to Heather. How about that?
okay, yep, you can all respond directly to me.
And if there are any significant things, you can send it out and we can look at it.
Okay,
again.
Okay.
But I would think it's just edits.
Okay.
right. Now, do I have to get a motion, or we're okay with just our discussion of it? We're good with our report?
No, I think we have to actually have
Do a
a
motion.
Motion to
Yep.
approve the report to the board.
Okay,
Second.
An amendment that, with the suggestions that
Yes.
we've just added.
Yes,
Yep.
with all the changes.
all those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carries unanimously. All right, I think that's everything on the agenda. We just talked about the June 13th meeting. We'll assume not to meet on that date, that if you have any comments, you'll email them back to Heather, and, and we're good from there. Hopefully, the board moves approval of our budget, and all is good.
I hope so.
Will they see this tomorrow night at their workshop?
This was going to be presented July
Oh, okay.
31st
Okay,
by Ms. Brown as part of the tentative adoption.
Okay,
perfect.
great.
But you could share that with your members.
I'll
that-
see her Thursday. I will be happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So,
All right.
we're adjourned then.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you.
Thank